Yamagata Masakage adjusted his grip on the reins, the lacquered leather creaking under his gauntlet. He could practically taste the fear wafting from across the Rengogawa River, a scent as pathetic as the rain-soaked soil beneath his horse's hooves. But what truly drew his eye, what knotted his brow in a mixture of pity and contempt, was the ridiculous wooden fence, a crude, sprawling stockade that stretched for what seemed like miles along the western bank. It was an admission of terror, a coward's ploy. This was the grand army of the supposed unifier of Japan, Oda Nobunaga? A mob of mud-stained peasants hiding behind hastily erected lumber, clutching clumsy fire sticks they barely knew how to use? Behind him, the finest cavalry in the land stamped and snorted, a coiled spring of muscle and steel forged in 100 victorious battles. His men, the famed Red Brigade, were a sea of crimson armor, each warrior a living legend, a master of the spear and the sword. They were the Takeda Kiba Gundan, the horse army, and their charge was as inevitable and as devastating as a tsunami. It had shattered every army that had ever dared to stand against it. It had sent the great Tokugawa Ieyasu himself fleeing for his life at Mikatagahara, so terrified he'd soiled his own armor. And now they were to be stopped by splinters and dirt? A low, rumbling laugh started in Masakage's chest and was quickly picked up by the veteran samurai commanders around him. The sound rippled through the ranks of the Takeda vanguard, a wave of arrogant amusement. Peasant levies, foreign toys, a wooden fence. This wasn't a battle, it was an execution, a formality on their march to the capital.
Their young lord, Takeda Katsuyori, was determined to prove he was even greater than his legendary father, the late Takeda Shingen. And Oda Nobunaga, in his infinite foolishness, was about to hand him that legacy on a platter. The story of the Takeda clan was not written in ink. It was hammered into the very soul of Sengoku Jidai Japan with the hooves of their 15,000 horsemen. For 2 generations, they had been the apex predators of a land defined by brutal conflict. Under the strategic genius of Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, they had perfected a form of warfare that blended Zen-like discipline with shocking violence. Their doctrine was encapsulated in the words on their war banners, the Fudan Kazan: as swift as the wind, as silent as the forest, as fierce as the fire, as immovable as the mountain. It wasn't poetry, it was a promise of destruction. At the heart of this promise was the cavalry charge. This was not the clumsy, disorganized gallop of lesser clans. The Takeda charge was a science. It was a symphony of violence conducted by masters. Their samurai were not merely soldiers, they were the product of a warrior tradition stretching back 1,000 years. From the moment they could walk, they trained with the yari, the long spear, until it was an extension of their own arm. They lived and died by a code that valued courage and martial prowess above all else. To die in a glorious, headlong charge against the enemy was the highest honor a samurai could achieve. And now, their new lord, Takeda Katsuyori, burned with a fire to surpass his father's shadow. He was young, ambitious, and high on the Takeda's most potent drug, invincibility.
Just 2 years prior, at the Battle of Mikatagahara, he had helped lead the force that didn't just defeat, but utterly humiliated the combined army of Tokugawa Ieyasu and Oda Nobunaga. The Oda relief force had been swept aside, and Tokugawa's army was annihilated, forcing him into one of the most desperate retreats in samurai history. The Takeda were more than confident. They were certain. They believed their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, combined with their peerless skill, made them unstoppable. Their opponent, Oda Nobunaga, was everything that Takeda were not. He was not from a historically powerful samurai clan. He was seen as a brutish upstart, a pragmatist with no respect for the gods, the emperor, or the ancient traditions of warfare. His nickname, the Demon King, was not one of affection. While the Takeda recruited from the samurai class, Nobunaga built his army on a revolutionary foundation, the Ashigaru. These were commoners, peasant farmers and woodcutters, conscripted and given basic training. To a Takeda warrior, an Ashigaru was barely human, little more than a walking obstacle on the way to a real fight. Handing a peasant a spear did not make him a warrior. Even more contemptible was Nobunaga's obsession with a new foreign weapon, the Tanegashima, or arquebus. This matchlock firearm had been introduced to Japan by Portuguese traders a mere 30 years earlier. To the samurai, it was a dishonorable abomination. It required no strength, no skill, no courage. A child could be taught to use one in a matter of days. It was loud, clumsy, and its effective range was a pathetic 80 to 100 meters. A skilled samurai archer could fire 5 arrows in the time it took an arquebusier to fire a single shot.
The reloading process was a nightmare of complex sequential steps. Measure the powder, pour it down the barrel, ram the ball and wadding, prime the pan, attach the match cord, aim, and fire. In the heat of battle, a single mistake could render the weapon useless, and if it rained, the damp powder and sputtering match cord made it little more than a heavy club. The samurai saw a battlefield where a single disciplined warrior, hardened by a lifetime of training, could charge forward and cut down a dozen of these fumbling peasants while they struggled to reload their noisy toys. The smoke from the black powder would choke the user and obscure the battlefield, turning order into chaos. It was a coward's weapon, one that allowed the weak to kill the strong from a distance without honor or glory. The Takeda elders had seen these weapons before. They had faced small contingents of them. They were a nuisance, a distraction, but they had never once decided the outcome of a major battle. Nobunaga's apparent reliance on them was, in their eyes, proof of his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of the art of war. The strategic situation had unfolded exactly as Katsuyori had planned. He had laid siege to Nagashino Castle, a key Tokugawa fortress. He knew that Tokugawa, Nobunaga's staunchest ally, could not allow it to fall. It was the perfect bait. As expected, Nobunaga had taken the bait, marching out with an army of 30,000 to relieve the siege. Tokugawa had joined him with another 8,000. Now, the combined Oda-Tokugawa force was arrayed across the river, daring to challenge the might of the 15,000-strong Takeda army. Katsuyori saw an opportunity his father had only dreamed of, to destroy Nobunaga and Tokugawa in a single decisive field battle.
He would not just win, he would annihilate them. He would cement his own legend and clear his path to Kyoto and the title of shogun. But that fence, it bothered the old guard. On the night of May 20th, 1575, in the Takeda command tent, the air was thick with the smell of lamp oil and simmering arrogance. The clan's most experienced generals, the last of Takeda Shingen's 4 heavenly kings, gathered to advise their young lord. Baba Nobuharu, the wisest and most respected of the veterans, spoke first. His voice was a low rasp, honed by decades of shouting orders over the din of battle. "My lord," he began, bowing deeply, "the enemy outnumbers us more than 2 to 1. They have chosen their ground well. This fence, it is a clear attempt to negate the power of our cavalry. A direct assault would be unwise. Let us feign a withdrawal, lure them out from behind their fortifications, and crush them in the open field where our horsemen are supreme." Naito Masatoyo, another veteran commander, nodded in agreement. "The castle is on the verge of starvation. We can simply continue the siege. Nobunaga's peasant army will lose heart and dissolve. There is no need for a rash frontal assault." Even Yamagata Masakage, a man who had never shied from a charge in his life, felt a prickle of unease. "They expect the charge, my lord. It is what we are famous for. To do the very thing they have prepared for is to fall into a trap of our own making." But Takeda Katsuyori would hear none of it. He was 29 years old, and the blood of the Tiger of Kai flowed hot in his veins. He had won at Mikatagahara.
He had taken the seemingly impregnable Takatenjin castle, a feat even his father had failed to achieve. He saw their caution not as wisdom, but as the timidity of old men. "A trap?" Katsuyori scoffed, his voice sharp. "A trap made of wood and rope? Manned by farmers who tremble when they hear our war drums? You insult the memory of my father and the spirit of every Takeda warrior. They are hiding because they are terrified. That fence is not a fortification, it is a symbol of their weakness. We will kick it down, we will ride over it, we will wash our spears in the blood of Nobunaga's peasant dogs, and show all of Japan what happens to those who dare stand against the Takeda. He looked at Yamagata Masakage, his most ferocious commander. Masakage, you will lead the first wave with your Red Brigade. You will shatter their left flank. Baba, you will follow and smash their center. We will roll them up from the flank and push them into the river. Tomorrow, we will not just defeat Oda Nobunaga, we will erase him. There was no room for debate. The decision was made. The hubris was absolute. The veteran commanders bowed, their faces grim masks of duty. They would obey their lord, even if they believed he was leading them into disaster. They were samurai. Their loyalty was absolute. As dawn broke on the 21st of May, a persistent drizzle fell over the plain of Nagashino. The Takeda army moved into formation, a fearsome spectacle of color and steel. Thousands of banners snapped in the damp breeze. The air hummed with the energy of 15,000 men preparing for battle. Across the river, the Oda lines were unnervingly still.
There were no grand displays, no samurai in ornate armor riding forth to announce their names and challenge their rivals to single combat. There was only the long, ugly brown line of the wooden stockade, and behind it, the silent ranks of Nobunaga's peasant army. Yamagata Masakage trotted his horse to the front of his Red Brigade. He surveyed the enemy line. He could see them now, thousands of them, huddled behind the fence. He could make out the long barrels of their arquebuses resting on the wooden beams. He had been told that Nobunaga had gathered an unprecedented number of these weapons, perhaps as many as 3,000. But what good were 3,000 clumsy toys against the finest cavalry in Japan? He imagined the chaos that would ensue after the first volley. The smoke, the confusion, the panicked fumbling to reload. His horsemen would be upon them before they could even think of firing a second shot. They would be over the fences and gutting the gunners in moments. The taiko drums began to beat, a deep, resonant pulse that was the very heartbeat of the Takeda clan. 1 beat per second. Thump, thump, thump. The signal to prepare. Masakage drew his own katana, its polished steel gleaming dully in the gray morning light. He looked at his men, their faces a mixture of fierce anticipation and absolute devotion. He was one of Shingen's heavenly kings. He was Yamagata Masakage. His destiny was to lead the charge. He turned his gaze back to the silent enemy, to the foolish fence, and to the rabble hiding behind it. He would give them the honor of being the first to be trampled under the hooves of the invincible Takeda cavalry. The drums quickened their beat. The order was given.
The order was given. A deep, guttural roar erupted from thousands of throats as the Red Brigade surged forward. The very ground trembled under the pounding of 1,000 hooves. This was the sight that had broken the nerve of countless armies. It was a living avalanche of crimson lacquer and polished steel, a spectacle of terrifying beauty. Yamagata Masakage was at its tip, a demon in red, his spear leveled, his eyes fixed on the flimsy wooden barrier ahead. He gauged the distance to the river, the soft, muddy banks his horses would have to cross before the final, glorious ascent into the enemy line. He could see the Oda Ashigaru more clearly now, their faces pale behind their conical jingasa hats. He saw the glowing ends of their match cords, like a swarm of fireflies in the gray mist. Let them have their one shot, he thought. It would be their last. Behind the palisade, inside the Oda lines, the air was electric with a different kind of energy. It was not the fiery arrogance of the Takeda, but the cold, coiled tension of a loaded spring. Here there was no room for individual glory. There was only the system. Oda Nobunaga, flanked by his most trusted general, Shibata Katsuie, watched the approaching wave of red from a command post on a small hill. He remained unnaturally calm, his gaze sweeping across his own lines, not the enemy's. He wasn't watching the charge, he was watching his men. For weeks he had drilled them relentlessly, not in swordsmanship, not in archery, but in a simple, brutal, and revolutionary sequence of movements. He had taken 3,000 of his 10,000 arquebusiers and arranged them into a special corps. These men were not scattered across the front as skirmishers, as was the common practice. They were concentrated, packed tightly behind the wooden stockades that the Takeda commanders so openly mocked. But this was no mere fence. It was a carefully engineered killing machine.
The zigzagging palisades were not meant to stop the charge cold, an impossible task. They were designed to break its momentum, to funnel the charging horses into narrow, pre-sighted lanes, forcing them to slow and turn, presenting their flanks. Gaps were intentionally left, tempting openings that led directly into overlapping fields of fire. The ground in front of the stockade had been subtly altered, churned up by work crews to create a muddy, uneven quagmire that would further disrupt the cavalry's footing. The true genius, however, was invisible to the Takeda. Behind the fence, the 3,000 gunners were not in a single line. They were arrayed in 3 ranks, one behind the other. Each rank consisted of 1,000 men. The first rank was kneeling, their arquebuses resting on the lower beams of the palisade, sights fixed on the churning mud 70 meters out. The second rank stood directly behind them, their weapons aimed over their comrades' heads. The third rank stood behind the second, their weapons at the ready, but they were not aiming. Their job was to reload. Nobunaga had solved the arquebuse's fatal weakness, its excruciatingly slow rate of fire. An individual soldier could not fire quickly, but a coordinated unit, acting as a single entity, could. The plan was simple in concept, but fiendishly difficult in execution. The first rank would fire. They would then immediately retreat to the back of the formation to begin the laborious reloading process. As they moved, the second rank would step forward and fire.
Then they too would retreat, and the third rank, their own weapons now loaded, would step into the firing line. By the time the third rank had fired, the first rank would be reloaded and ready to step forward again. It was a human machine gun, a system designed to produce a continuous rolling thunder of lead, a storm from which there was no shelter and no reprieve. To ensure this complex choreography worked under the terrifying pressure of a Takeda cavalry charge, Nobunaga had assigned his best commanders to oversee the gunners. Sasa Narimasa and Maeda Toshii walked the lines, their voices sharp and clear, reminding the men of their training. "Hold your fire. Hold until the signal. Do not fire for glory. Fire for the man beside you. Trust the system." The Ashigaru gripping their matchlocks were terrified. They could feel the earthquake of the approaching charge through the soles of their straw sandals. The demonic, horned helmets and snarling face masks of the samurai were becoming visible. Every instinct screamed at them to fire, to run, to do anything. But they held. They had been drilled to obey, to become cogs in their lord's machine. Their faith was not in their own courage, but in Nobunaga's plan. Yamagata Masakage's Red Brigade hit the Rengogawa River at a full gallop. Water and mud exploded into the air. The horses, superbly trained, churned through the shallow stream, their momentum barely checked. They scrambled up the western bank, entering the kill zone. 50 meters, the perfect range. Masakage raised his katana, the signal for the final, devastating sprint. He opened his mouth to scream a war cry that would shatter the peasants' resolve. He never got the chance. From his command post, Oda Nobunaga raised a single war fan.
It dropped. Along the Oda line, hundreds of sub-commanders' flags relayed the signal instantly. The shout went up, "Ichiban, ute!" Number 1, fire. 1,000 match cords descended onto 1,000 flash pans. For a split second, there was a fizzing sound, 1,000 points of light spiring in the damp air. Then, the world exploded. An enormous single clap of thunder, louder than anything ever heard on a Japanese battlefield, ripped across the plain. A solid wall of white and gray smoke erupted from the entire length of the palisade, completely obscuring the Oda line. From this cloud burst a horizontal hailstorm of lead. 1,000 lead balls, each the size of a man's thumb, tore through the air at over 1,000 feet per second. They struck the front rank of the Red Brigade like a physical blow from a giant's fist. The effect was apocalyptic. The Takeda samurai were elite, their armor the finest in Japan, crafted by masters to turn aside arrows and sword blows. It was utterly useless against the kinetic energy of a close-range musket ball. The lead slugs punched through lacquered steel breastplates as if they were paper. They shattered bone, tore through muscle, and turned men who were the epitome of martial prowess into collapsing sacks of meat. Horses, less armored and presenting a much larger target, were devastated. They shrieked in agony as their legs were shattered and their chests ripped open, collapsing in tangled, screaming heaps that tripped the riders behind them. Yamagata Masakage felt a searing pain in his left shoulder as a ball ripped through his armor and shattered his clavicle. His horse was hit in the neck and went down instantly, throwing him into the mud. Dazed, his ears ringing from the deafening blast, he pushed himself up.
What he saw was a vision from a Buddhist hell. His Red Brigade, the pride of the Takeda, the unstoppable force of nature, was gone. In its place was a writhing, chaotic pile of dead and dying men and animals. At least a third of his vanguard had been obliterated in a single, terrifying instant. The charge hadn't just been stopped, it had been erased. The smoke was still clearing. The survivors, stunned and confused, tried to regain their footing, to make sense of the carnage. Their minds, conditioned for a world of spears and swords, could not process what had just happened. They were looking for the gap, the moment when the enemy would be reloading, the moment they could surge forward and take their revenge. Before they could even form a coherent thought, a second shout came from the impenetrable wall of smoke. "Niban, ute! Number 2, fire!" A second, identical cataclysm of sound and fury erupted. Another 1,000 balls ripped through the mangled remnants of the first wave and tore into the ranks of the second, who had been charging right behind them. The disciplined lines of Takeda samurai dissolved into sheer pandemonium. Men who had never known fear were suddenly gripped by a primal terror. Their courage, their skill, their lifetime of training, it meant nothing. They were being slaughtered by invisible enemies, killed by thunder and lightning wielded by peasants. And then, the third shout. "Sanban, ute! Number 3, fire!" The third volley crashed into the now stalled and panicked mob. It was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. The brilliant rolling fire system was working perfectly. There was no pause, no respite. Just a continuous, disciplined, mechanical process of death.
By the time the third rank had fired, the first 1,000 men, their faces blackened with powder, were stepping forward again, their arquebuses reloaded, ready to begin the cycle anew. Nobunaga's machine was fully operational. Baba Nobuharu, leading the second major wave of the Takeda assault, watched in absolute horror from further back. He saw the legendary Red Brigade, a force he had fought alongside for 30 years, simply vanished into a cloud of smoke. He could not understand. How were they firing so fast? It defied all logic. It defied the known laws of warfare. He had expected a single volley, a nuisance to be weathered before the real fight began. He had not expected a ceaseless hurricane of lead that shredded men and horses alike. Takeda Katsuyori, watching from his own command post, was incandescent with rage and disbelief. His eyes were wide with shock. "What is this sorcery?" he snarled. "They cannot fire that fast. It's a trick." He refused to accept the evidence of his own eyes. This was not a superior strategy. It was an affront to the natural order of things. "Sound the advance!" he screamed at his heralds. "Baba, Naito, all forces, charge! Overwhelm them with numbers. Do not stop. Do not falter. Charge!" The Takeda taiko drums, which had fallen silent in the shock of the first volleys, began to beat again, this time with a frantic, desperate rhythm. The second wave, led by the grimly fatalistic Baba Nobuharu, lowered their spears and charged, not into an enemy line, but into the hellish wreckage of their own vanguard. They galloped over the bodies of their comrades, their horses slipping in the blood-soaked mud, their ears assaulted by the unending roar of the arquebuses.
Behind Nobunaga's palisade, the Oda Ashigaru were no longer frightened peasants. They were transformed. They had seen gods in crimson armor fall before them. They had seen the invincible Takeda cavalry shattered by their hands. The terror was gone, replaced by a grim, focused adrenaline. They were no longer individuals. They were a single, pulsing engine of destruction. Load, ram, prime, step, aim, fire. Retreat, reload. Again and again. The barrels of their arquebuses grew hot, the air thick and acrid with the stench of sulfur. They did not need to see their targets clearly through the dense smoke. They just had to point their weapons into the screaming chaos in front of them and pull the trigger. The storm of lead would do the rest. The storm of lead would do the rest. Baba Nobuharu's charge met the exact same fate as the one that had preceded it. He was a veteran of over 20 major battles, a man whose tactical acumen was legendary. He tried to adapt, screaming at his men to spread out, to find a weak point in the unending wall of smoke and noise. But there was no weak point. The firing was not concentrated in one section, it was everywhere. It rose and fell in a deafening, rhythmic cadence, a mechanical heartbeat of death. The palisades, which had looked so crude and flimsy from a distance, now revealed their devilish purpose. They channeled his horsemen into kill zones, preventing them from building up the momentum for a truly crushing charge. Horses stumbled on the uneven ground and became entangled in the bodies of the first wave, creating perfect stationary targets for the gunners. A lead ball smashed into Baba Nobuharu's ornate helmet, spinning him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming. As he struggled to rise, another ball tore through his side, piercing his domadu armor. He fell to his knees, clutching the wound, blood pouring through his fingers. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the field of carnage. He saw Takeda samurai, the proudest warriors in Japan, dismounted and desperate, trying to clamber over the stockade on foot, only to be shot down like animals. He saw them trying to retreat, only to be caught in the fire of the next volley. He saw banners, sacred heirlooms of ancient clans, lying trampled in the mud. In that moment, he knew it was over. Not just the battle. Everything. The age of the samurai, the age of the horse and the spear, was dying here, in this field of mud and blood, choked by the sulphurous smoke of these dishonorable foreign weapons. With his last breath, he drew his sword and plunged it into his own belly, choosing to die by his own hand rather than be butchered by a peasant's bullet. The third Takeda wave, led by Naito Masatoyo, suffered an even worse fate. By now the area in front of the Oda lines was a veritable charnel house. A thick rampart of dead and dying horses and men had formed, creating a gruesome and almost impassable obstacle. Naito's charge was slowed to a crawl before it even reached the river, forcing his men to navigate a horrific maze of their fallen comrades while under continuous, unrelenting fire. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The Takeda warriors were witnessing something that their entire culture, their entire worldview, had told them was impossible. Their legendary charge was not just being stopped, it was being systematically and effortlessly dismantled.
Panic began to set in. Horses, maddened by the noise and the smell of blood, became uncontrollable, throwing their riders and bolting back through their own lines, sowing chaos and confusion. Samurai, their minds shattered by the sensory overload, simply froze in place, unable to process the scale of the disaster, only to be cut down moments later. The Takeda attack, once a symphony of disciplined violence, had degenerated into a series of disjointed, suicidal rushes. Small groups of the bravest or most desperate samurai would manage to reach the palisade, only to find another cruel aspect of Nobunaga's design. As they tried to pull down the wooden beams or climb over them, they were met by ranks of Oda Ashigaru armed with extra-long pikes, 3 to 4 meters in length. These pikemen, protected by the stockade, could thrust at the mounted samurai with impunity, skewering them and their horses from behind the safety of the barrier, while the gunners continued to reload and fire. It was a layered defense, a meat grinder from which there was no escape. On his command hill, Takeda Katsuyori was in a state of frantic denial. His generals were being killed, his elite units annihilated, his invincible army was melting away before his eyes. He screamed orders that were becoming increasingly irrational. He sent his own personal guard into the fray, then the reserves, throwing good money after bad in a desperate gamble to somehow punch through the wall of lead by sheer force of will. He was a man possessed, unable to accept that the very foundation of his clan's power was a fatal anachronism. He still believed that if just one of his samurai could get over that fence, his superior spirit and skill would prevail. One of the most powerful Takeda commanders, Tsuchiya Masatsugu, seeing the utter futility of the situation, turned to his son. "Our Lord has led us to ruin," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The Takeda name is finished, but we are samurai. Let us go to our deaths with honor. Follow me." He led his men in a final, hopeless charge directly into the teeth of the Oda guns, vanishing into the smoke like all the others. The battle had raged for 6 grueling hours. The initial thunderous volleys had settled into a steady, methodical rhythm of slaughter.
The barrels of the Oda arquebuses were so hot they were branding the hands of the ashigaru who held them. The gunners' faces were black masks of soot, their shoulders bruised raw from the recoil. But they did not stop. They fired, reloaded, and fired again, their movements becoming a grim, automatic ballet. They had fired an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 rounds of ammunition. The Takeda army had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. It was now just a terrified mob, trapped between the river and the ceaseless fire from the palisades. Finally, Oda Nobunaga saw his moment. The Takeda were broken, their spirit shattered, their leaders dead. The rolling volleys began to slow. He gave a new signal. From the flanks of the Oda line, gates in the palisades swung open. Fresh troops, who had been held in reserve for this very purpose, poured onto the field. These were Nobunaga's own elite samurai and pikemen, and the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had been watching the massacre with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. The counterattack was the final nail in the coffin. The surviving Takeda warriors, dismounted, disorganized, and demoralized, were in no condition to resist.
They were exhausted, their weapons fouled with mud, their minds reeling from the horror of the day. The Oda and Tokugawa forces fell upon them with a vengeance, cutting them down without mercy. The hunt was on. Takeda Katsuyori finally awoke from his stupor of denial. A handful of his retainers, his hatamoto, surrounded him, begging him to flee. "My lord, it is lost. You must save yourself. The Takeda clan must not die with you," they pleaded, grabbing the reins of his horse. With tears of rage and humiliation streaming down his face, Katsuyori allowed himself to be led from the field. He turned his horse and fled, leaving the remnants of his glorious army to be butchered. His flight was the final signal for a general rout. Every surviving Takeda soldier broke and ran, casting aside their weapons, their armor, their pride, anything to escape the horrifying killing field. The pursuit was relentless. Oda and Tokugawa samurai, sensing a truly historic victory, chased the fleeing Takeda for miles, cutting down stragglers. The Rengogawa River, once a mere obstacle, now ran red with blood. The retreat was a greater disaster than the battle itself. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were so staggering they were almost unbelievable. Of the 15,000-strong Takeda army that had confidently marched onto the field that morning, over 10,000 lay dead. This included a catastrophic loss of their experienced leadership. Yamagata Masakage, Baba Nobuharu, Naito Masatoyo, Hara Masatane, Sanada Nobutsuna, and his younger brother Masateru. Nearly all of Takeda Shingen's most trusted and brilliant generals were dead. The Takeda clan had lost more veteran commanders and elite samurai in a single day than in the previous 30 years of constant warfare. Their legendary cavalry, the pride of the nation, was utterly annihilated.
On the Oda Tokugawa side, the casualties were astonishingly light. Estimates range from as low as 2,000 to perhaps 6,000, but a significant portion of those were incurred during the final pursuit and mopping up operations. The number of men lost behind the palisades was minimal. Nobunaga's peasant gunners had won one of the most decisive battles in Japanese history at a fraction of the cost of their opponents. The Battle of Nagashino was more than just a military victory. It was a revolution. It was the moment when technology and strategy decisively triumphed over tradition and martial spirit. Nobunaga had not simply defeated the Takeda, he had rendered their entire way of war obsolete. The samurai's belief in the supremacy of individual courage and skill, honed over a millennium, had been proven tragically, horrifically wrong. A well-drilled peasant with a firearm and a good defensive position was now worth more than the most legendary swordsman on horseback. The news of the disaster spread like wildfire across Japan, sending shockwaves through the samurai class. The Takeda clan, the most feared military power in the land, was shattered beyond repair. They would never again mount a serious challenge for supremacy. Their decline was swift and brutal. 7 years later, Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu would march into the Takeda heartland of Kai province, and Takeda Katsuyori, a hunted fugitive, would commit seppuku on a mountainside, extinguishing the main line of the once mighty clan forever.
Nagashino cemented Oda Nobunaga's reputation as a ruthless, brilliant, and forward-thinking innovator. He had seen the future of warfare, and it was a future based on massed infantry, disciplined volley fire, and combined arms tactics, not on the glorious but outdated cavalry charge. Other daimyo were forced to adapt or perish. The demand for arquebuses skyrocketed.
Armies were reorganized and military doctrine was rewritten. The Sengoku Jidai had entered its final, bloody phase, a phase that would be dominated by the tactics Nobunaga had perfected at Nagashino. The legacy of that rainy day in May 1575 was profound. It was a brutal lesson in the unforgiving nature of military evolution. The Takeda samurai had laughed at Nobunaga's peasant army and their clumsy fire sticks. They had charged forward, convinced that their spirit and their thousand-year tradition made them invincible. They had died for that belief. Their laughter had been silenced by the roar of 3,000 arquebuses, a sound that heralded not just the death of an army, but the end of an era. The age of the sword was over. The age of the gun had begun. The age of the gun had begun. To truly understand the seismic shift that occurred at Nagashino, one must look beyond the battlefield and into the very soul of the samurai class. Their entire identity was built on a foundation of personal martial skill. A samurai's worth was measured by his prowess with the sword, the spear, and the bow. Status, honor, and land were won through acts of individual valor. The epic tales that formed their cultural bedrock, like the Heike Monogatari, were filled with stories of heroic warriors riding forth, announcing their lineage, and engaging in glorious single combat. Warfare was an art, a ritual, and a deeply personal test of a man's character. The arquebus was the antithesis of all of this. It was an impersonal, anonymous weapon. It democratized killing. The years of grueling training required to master the bow or the spear were rendered irrelevant by a weapon that any peasant could learn to use effectively in a week.
The strength required to wield a heavy naginata, or the courage to charge into a melee, meant nothing when faced with a lead ball fired from 100 meters away by an unseen foe. At Nagashino, the Takeda samurai, men who could cut a falling leaf in half with their katana, were killed by farmers who might never have held a weapon before in their lives. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a profound and deeply felt humiliation. It challenged their very reason for being. Oda Nobunaga's genius was not simply in recognizing the potential of the firearm. Many other daimyo had arquebuses. His true genius was twofold. First, he understood logistics on a scale his rivals could barely comprehend. Acquiring 3,000 arquebuses was a monumental undertaking in itself, but the real challenge was supplying them. For the Battle of Nagashino, Nobunaga's quartermasters had to procure and transport an immense quantity of black powder and lead shot. The black powder, a volatile mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, had to be kept dry in Japan's humid, rainy climate, a logistical nightmare. Each arquebusier would carry enough for perhaps 20 shots, but Nobunaga ensured that massive reserves were available just behind the lines. He standardized the caliber of the weapons as much as possible, simplifying the supply of ammunition. He was thinking not like a samurai warlord, but like a modern general, treating war as a problem of industrial supply and systematic application of force. Second, and more importantly, Nobunaga understood that the new weapon required a new kind of soldier and a new kind of army. The traditional samurai ethos of individual glory was not just irrelevant, it was a liability. The volley fire system depended on absolute, unquestioning discipline and cohesion.
A soldier who fired too early, seeking personal glory, or one who broke ranks to reload, could disrupt the entire rhythm and compromise the line. Nobunaga's ashigaru were drilled not to be heroes, but to be components. Their strength came not from their individual skill, but from their perfect integration into the larger machine. He stripped warfare of its romance and ritual and refined it into a brutal, efficient science. The mockable wooden palisade was a physical manifestation of this new philosophy. It was ugly, crude, and utterly devoid of the aesthetic elegance of a samurai castle, but it was perfectly functional. It was a tool designed for a single purpose, to facilitate the efficient slaughter of the enemy. It was pure pragmatism,
a quality Nobunaga possessed in abundance and his more traditional rivals fatally lacked. He did not care about honor, he cared about results, and the result at Nagashino was the complete vindication of his methods. In the aftermath, the survivors of the Takeda clan stumbled back to their home province of Kai, bringing with them tales of an almost supernatural horror. They spoke of a continuous thunder that never ceased, of a wall of smoke from which death flew invisibly, and of their bravest heroes dying without ever laying a hand on the enemy. The psychological wound inflicted on the Takeda was as deep as the physical one. Their core belief in their own superiority had been shattered. How could they fight an enemy who refused to fight honorably, an enemy who stood behind a fence and killed from a distance with loud, foul-smelling tubes? For Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would one day go on to unify all of Japan and establish a shogunate that would last for 250 years, Nagashino was a formative experience.
He had suffered his most humiliating defeat at the hands of the Takeda cavalry at Mikatagahara. At Nagashino, he stood beside Nobunaga and witnessed the complete and utter destruction of that same cavalry force. The lesson was seared into his mind. He became a master of integrating firearms into his armies and, like Nobunaga, embraced a pragmatic, patient, and strategic approach to warfare. The alliance forged between Nobunaga and Ieyasu, built on mutual respect for each other's strengths, became the central power block that would ultimately end the Sengoku Jidai's century of chaos. The battle also had a profound impact on the arms race in Japan. Every daimyo who wished to survive scrambled to acquire as many arquebuses as possible. Japanese swordsmiths and metalworkers, already among the finest in the world, reverse-engineered the Portuguese designs and began producing firearms on an industrial scale. Within a few years, Japan became one of the most heavily armed nations on Earth, possessing more firearms than any single European country. Armies swelled in size as large formations of ashigaru gunners became the new standard. The era of small-scale samurai skirmishes was well and truly over. The future belonged to massive infantry armies clashing in clouds of gunpowder smoke. Ironically, the very weapon that sealed the fate of the old samurai class was eventually brought under control by the new order they helped create. When Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified the country and established his shogunate, he instituted a strict, hierarchical society. To prevent future rebellions, his government severely restricted the production and ownership of firearms, effectively initiating a period of re-traditionalization. The sword, which had been rendered obsolete on the battlefield, was resurrected as a powerful symbol of the samurai's status as the ruling class in a time of peace.
The age of the gun in Japan was brilliant, bloody, and ultimately brief. But the echoes of the thunder at Nagashino never truly faded. The story of the battle became a cautionary tale, a brutal reminder that no tradition, no matter how glorious or deeply entrenched, is immune to the relentless march of innovation. The Takeda samurai, peerless in their chosen form of warfare, were the masters of a dying art. They charged into the future armed with the weapons of the past and were annihilated for it. Their arrogance, their refusal to respect a new and unfamiliar threat, and their rigid adherence to outdated doctrine proved to be their downfall. In the end, the laughter of the veteran samurai commanders on that rainy May morning was the last gasp of a doomed world. They looked across the Rengogawa River and saw peasants, a crude fence, and clumsy toys. They failed to see the meticulously planned system, the logistical brilliance, and the cold, pragmatic mind of the man who had orchestrated it all. They believed they were charging towards a glorious victory that would cement their legend. Instead, they were riding into a perfectly prepared trap, an abattoir designed by a new kind of warrior for a new age of war. The volleys fired by Nobunaga's 3,000 ashigaru were not just aimed at the Takeda army. They were a fatal fusillade against 1,000 years of history, tradition, and the very idea of what it meant to be a samurai.